Okay, so today I am going to essentially really be talking you through a sort of a substantial part of my book, which came out in 2018, which is called South African Gothic. I'm not going to go all the way to the end of the book. I was planning on doing that, but then I realized that even though we have a kind of a big, long-ranging time slot, that I think there might actually just have been too much. So I'm not going to get the last chapter, but I'm happy to talk about that if people want to in the discussion section. Okay, so I'm going to start out with these three questions: South African Gothic, what is it, when is it, and sort of slightly more mysteriously, why is it? So what is it? South African Gothic is a strand of South African literature that draws on and adapts and localizes Gothic figures and strategies. And specifically, as we'll kind of see as we go on, we're talking about strategies of monstrosity, an interest in the uncanny, figures of haunting, and then the part that we're not going to really get to today is the bodily horror. But again, like I said, if you want to talk about that, we can do that later on. So when is South African Gothic? It's most pronounced from the late 20th century, so remember after the 1970s, and it escalates in the new millennium. But it's also markedly present around the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And this is quite important. These moments, you'll see the moments of transition, these kind of turning points, are crucial to the way that I think about what South African Gothic is. And then this third, slightly, as I say, more mysterious question: why is South African Gothic? Perhaps a better way of phrasing this would have been, what is it for? And so my sense of Gothic in South African literature is that its function changes across time. So it functions differently in different time periods. But sort of as a big overall statement, we can say something like, South African Gothic does three things. In the first instance, it's an index of collective anxiety. In the second, it's a vocabulary for interrogating oppressive power formations and their residual cultural formations. And then in the third instance, it's a generative literary vocabulary that forges new concepts for the specifically post-apartheid period. And I'm going to unpack all of that. I realize that's quite a lot of kind of dense information at this stage, but I will unpack all of that as we go on. So why is South African Gothic interesting? I think is an important question. It is interesting perhaps in the first instance because it has not really been talked about very much within South African literature or within Gothic criticism. And the reason for its kind of under-examination in South African literature may be attributed to a kind of a reticence that has existed in South African literary criticism around talking about fiction that is not specifically realist. And this has got to do with a sense that over the course of the 20th century in particular, South African literature has been a very politically engaged body of work. And up until quite recently, there has been a kind of a hesitation or a question mark over the kind of politicalness of forms like Gothic, forms which are not kind of facing up to the hard reality of the situation. So this is perhaps one of the reasons why nobody's really talked about South African Gothic very much. Another reason that this is an interesting subject in particular is that we don't get less Gothic after the fall of apartheid. We get more Gothic. And again, I'm going to talk about this a little bit. And that might seem that's a kind of a counterintuitive situation. So apartheid, regime of violence, and after its end, so in a period of liberation, Gothic, which is a form of fiction making that is really preoccupied with violence, kind of ascends and escalates. And then another reason why it might be an interesting, why South African Gothic is an interesting thing to think about, is that kind of relates to that first point is that the literary and social context of South Africa is one which has been overtly politicized in lots of different ways, and that is also sort of ethically fraught in lots of different ways. And so thinking about how Gothic works in the literary canon of that particular context might help us to think about how genre fiction, or so-called genre fiction more generally, engages with politics and ethics. So for example, a question mark over Gothic in the context of South Africa might have to do with the way that Gothic is preoccupied with violence in a kind of a spectacularized or aestheticized form. And we could ask, what are the kind of ethical ramifications of that kind of fiction making in a context where violence has been prevalent as state-sanctioned torture, for example, under apartheid, or as crime in the contemporary moment. So these are sort of three kind of roads into why we might want to think about South African Gothic. And I think that also, and I would say this just maybe now because I don't want to keep coming back to it, but my sense of thinking about Gothic forms in South African literature can help us to think about how Gothic forms work in post-colonial context more widely, and also actually also actually across the global north and the global south. So I think South Africa raises lots of the issue of Gothic in South Africa raises questions which kind of help us to think through how Gothic works generally in the contemporary context. Okay, so the structure of this talk, which I realize has already started, but from here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna very, very briefly run through a timeline of colonialism, apartheid, and post-apartheid periods in South Africa, because I recognize that these are not necessarily this is not necessarily a history that everybody's going to be familiar with. And then from there, I'm gonna think about how the word Gothic can be related to South African literature. And I'm gonna try and keep this as kind of efficient and elegant as I can, but just a sort of a warning, this will be the sort of theory-dense part of the discussion. And again, if I say things which don't make immediate sense because I've jumped ahead of myself or I have tried to simplify or oversimplify, please do feel free to ask me questions about that stuff in the breaks. And then after that, I'm going to situate these upsurges of Gothic that I've already sort of mentioned that happen in South African literature around the fall of apartheid. And I'm calling it the long fall of apartheid because I'm going to look at the period from the 1970s to the sort of early 2000s. And I'm thinking about that entire period as the long fall of apartheid. Apartheid officially falls in 1994. And then also I will situate Gothic in the context of late 19th century South Africa, specifically in the context of what is often referred to as South Africa's mineral revolution, which has got to do with the discovery of gold. Okay, and then from there, I'm gonna identify, contextualize, and sort of briefly analyze three Gothic moments in late 20th century and early millennial. Three Gothic moments, they're not all in late 20th century and early millennial South Africa, two of them are. So the first period I'm going to talk about is the Mineral Revolution, which is, like I say, end of the 19th century. Then I'm going to talk about the late 70s and 80s, which is a period in South African history that's often called the Interregnum. And then I'm going to talk about the transitional period around 1994. So the period over the kind of official shift from apartheid to democracy. Okay, so very brief timeline. I'm not going to mention everything on my timeline here. I'm going to just try and sort of point you to I'm going to try and point you to the sort of markers which will help you to orientate you in this particular discussion, right? So this is not comprehensive. It's already not comprehensive, and I'm going to be even more selective with this non-comprehensive timeline. So the sort of beginning of colonization in South Africa is 1652 with the arrival of the Dutch and the displacement of indigenous peoples from the Cape region, which is the sort of southernmost tip of South Africa. In 1806, Britain gains control of South Africa, and those are the two kind of colonial or settler populations which kind of shape the settler well, the settler populations of South Africa. So I will probably refer to, I'll probably use the word Afrikaner at some point. Afrikaans is a language which is adapted from Dutch, and Afrikaners are the sort of, I mean, I'm kind of vacillating around saying this because the history is much more complicated than this, but a kind of a simplistic way of saying this is that the Afrikaans community are the descendants of Dutch settlers, and then there is an English-speaking component to the settler population as well, who sort of, and that English-speaking component derives from British settlement. So these two colonial powers settle in South Africa, the Dutch and the British. Okay, skipping forward. The next thing I want to point out is 1884, high point of imperialism. This is the year of the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa. So this is where the kind of the powers of Northern Europe were sort of fighting it out over bits of the colonized world, and South Africa plays a key role in this as well. In 1886, gold is discovered in the Witwatersrand in which is sort of in the region of where Johannesburg is now, and this is the Witwatersrand was at the time in an Afrikaner-controlled territory. This is the period of the mineral revolution that I've already mentioned. Okay, and then skipping forward massively from there, in 1948, the National Party is voted in to government on the policy of apartheid, which is which would then, over the rest of the 20th century, officially segregate South Africa's institutions and populations, and it's hard to overstate the kind of totality of this segregating program. So apartheid was a program of geographical segregation, racial segregation, but and in that sense, it was a segregation that hinged on an urban-rural divide. But then apartheid also segregated education, the school system, marriage, church, and then right the way down to kind of petty institutions, park benches, entrances to buildings, these sorts of things. Right, and then again, skipping forward again, 1966, between 1966 and 1975, many states in sub-Saharan Africa began to decolonize. So, but South Africa did not, right? So this is the kind of point I want to make here. So around about the period of the late 20th century, where other states in Africa were gaining their independence, apartheid was kind of reaching what is often referred to as its high tide, right? And then from there, where do we go? 1994, first democratic election. This was a negotiated revolution, so that's something that's important to remember. There was no violent revolution. There was no violent overthrow of power. The shift from apartheid as a system of official segregation to democracy was something which was kind of talked out between the ANC, the African National Congress, which is the party that's still in power and who led the resistance movement over the 20th century, and the National Party, who was who were the architects of the apartheid state. And then the last thing I want to point out here is that in 1996, it's actually 1996 to 1998, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission ran in South Africa. And this is something that people may be familiar with. It's often acronymized as the TRC. It was a special tribunal that was set up to hear the testimony of perpetrators and victims of apartheid-era crimes. It had the jurisdiction to grant amnesty to apartheid-era criminals, and it served also as a forum for people to speak about the experience of violence under the auspices of the apartheid state. Okay, so South African Gothic, moving on. So South African Gothic, as I've already mentioned, I think of South African Gothic as being a literary phenomenon that is that is inextricably connected to periods of transition, periods of change and upheaval. So South African Gothic emerges, like I've already said, with this kind of force over the transition from apartheid to democracy. And again, I'm thinking of that as a long period of time. So from around about the mid-70s, 1920s, we see this kind of escalation of sinister forms in literature, forms drawn from a kind of Gothic canon. But then there is a kind of a precursor moment to that, which is the rapid transformations around the mineral revolution at the end of the 19th century as well. And so this is not something which I have kind of come up with myself, this connection between Gothic and periods of transition. There are precedents for this in existing criticism around Gothic literature. So this is a quote from David Punter's kind of now really formative book on Gothic, The Literature of Terror, and it's connecting the rise of Gothic in the 18th century to shifts in socioeconomic shifts that are attendant on the Industrial Revolution. So Punter writes, the period that saw the birth of the Gothic novel was that in which the early forces of industrialization were producing vast changes in the ways that people lived and worked. Rural patterns of life were being broken up by the enclosure of land and by the labor demands of urban-centered industry. The stability of an at least theoretically long accepted social structure, I see that I've left out half of that. Basically, the stability of the end of that sentence is, was being called into question, right? So Punter is linking the rise of the Gothic to kind of capital-driven shifts at the level of society. This is Fred Botting making a related but kind of slightly more complex version of a similar point. So Botting writes, 18th century writers liked to refer to their present as modern and thus distinct from a feudal past regarded as a barbaric and primitive stage. Emerging at a time of bourgeois and industrial revolution, but then also, so this is kind of Botting's intervention here, a time of Enlightenment philosophy and increasingly secular views, the 18th century Gothic fascination with a past of chivalry, violence, magical beings, and malevolent aristocrats is bound up with shifts from feudal to commercial practices in which notions of property, government, and society were undergoing massive transformations. And then this continues on the next slide. So along with these shifts, ideas about nature, art, and subjectivity were also reassessed. Gothic thus resonates as much with anxieties and fears concerning the crises and changes in the present as with any terrors of the past. The rejection of feudal barbarity, superstition, and tyranny was necessary to a culture defining itself in diametrically opposed terms. Its progress, civilization, and maturity depended on the distance it established between the values of the present and those of the past. Okay, so essentially the thought here, I think the thought that we can kind of extract from both of those, from those two quotations is something like periods of change generate anxiety at the level of the collective. They generate social anxiety. And this is because they break up established patterns of life and they overturn established certainties so that there is a sense of bewildering disorientation that kind of proliferates in moments of radical upheaval. These same moments of radical upheaval, they require a reassessment of social institutions, identities, and values. And then they also require a rethinking of the relationship between ideas about the past and the present. And this is because the present is changing. And so the sense is that history comes to be called into question in moments when the present when the present itself changes. Okay. So, amid the 18th century economic and epistemic shifts, Gothic represents history as dark and barbarous, and in this way it assists the constitution of a new self-consciously modern society, which is defined by its enlightenment and its civilization. Essentially, its difference from the past. So the sense I'm trying to point out here is that Gothic is in this instance functioning in a kind of a conservative sense, right? It's kind of a mode of something like crisis management, right? Shifts are happening, change is happening, and the Gothic crops up to give enlightened society a sense of its own coherence and identity, basically by providing it with a counterpoint, right? So Gothic, it kind of assists in shoring up or stabilizing society during a moment of change. But, right, and this is a slightly more complex point, This means that Gothic also undermines that modern distinction. It also undermines that sense of separation between the past and the present, because Gothic pasts are not actually distinct from Enlightenment presents, right? They are actually about Enlightenment. Gothic is invented by and for Enlightenment as a stabilizing mechanism. And this situation in itself shows this fact that Gothic is something which is invented, right? That the past is invented as a dark, barbarous space. This shows that actually Gothic and Enlightenment are really interconnected, not actually separated. So on the one hand, we have Gothic functioning in a kind of an organizing, stabilizing sense, but then even as that's happening, the very process of that organization and stabilization actually undermines the organizing effort that is in play. Okay. So, recap, right? Gothic registers anxieties that emerge with social upheaval in a vocabulary of heightened supernatural threat. Gothic mobilizes this anxious vocabulary conservatively to form a counterpoint that shores up hegemonized social organization or ideology. But Gothic also undermines this conservative project because it is not about the past or the other, but actually about the anxieties of the self. Okay, so, and this is this kind of the point I'm trying to get to all the way. The point I'm trying to get to is that, so Gothic reflects on the one hand an impulse to organize, to stabilize, to shore up, and then on the other hand, it reflects a failure of this impulse, or it actually enacts a failure of this impulse. It is conservative and then potentially critical and interrogative. Right. So what does this have to do with South Africa? So this program that I've kind of just outlined, this kind of sense of the Gothic that I've outlined, it's picked up in different ways at different periods in South African history to serve different functions. Consistently, I think we can say that Gothic in South African fiction registers anxieties of change in a lexicon of hyperbolized supernatural threat. At certain instances, we can say that Gothic mobilizes this lexicon, albeit imperfectly, to shore up an established organization of society and self. And then at other points, and specifically latterly, right, in the post-apartheid period, Gothic in South African literature capitalizes on the failure of the conservative project. So Gothic in the post-apartheid period, like much post-colonial Gothic, it reveals the self or society to be unstable and so inseparable from its constructed other. So my sense of post-apartheid South African Gothic, the Gothic that arises around the shift from apartheid to democracy, is that it kind of exploits or capitalizes on that, that kind of incipient sense which is present in early Gothic in the 18th century and then across much of the 19th century, that kind of incipient sense of disorganization that takes place even as Gothic is attempting to kind of stabilize identities and at the level of individual and society. Okay. So, in fact, let me see, where are we? I think actually perhaps I was going to stop after the next section, but I think actually perhaps having just hit you with that theory, all of that theory, I will stop now and you can ask me things which questions that you may or may not have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and there we go. Okay. So, does anybody have anything that they want to ask at this point? Anything confusing or? Let's see, where are we? I think. Go on.
I don't have any questions at the moment. I am having definite flashbacks, though, Rebecca.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's good.
I have a question, but I think you're just about to answer it because I was going to ask about, I wasn't quite getting what the mineral revolution was, but it seems like from the slide, you're just about to talk about that.
Yeah, I am, yes. Yes, yes. I am about to talk about the mineral revolution and Imperial Gothic in South Africa. So is everybody's pretty on board? I'm hoping.
I think
it looks like it. Yes?
I have a really quick question. Actually, maybe I should save it.
No.
I'll tell you the question and you tell me if I should save it. So, I'm wondering, because you're bringing up all these similarities between things that happened historically in South Africa, that I can see similarities in what happens in colonization in America. And so I'm wondering if you think it is useful, we have talked about this very briefly before, but how useful you think it is to make comparisons across different colonized nations. Is that a useful thing to do, or does that sort of take away from the meaning and specific harm that happens to specific people in different regions, despite their shared fact of being colonized?
Yes, this is a great question. Very complicated. I expect nothing less from you, Madeline. So it depends on, the answer I think essentially is, it depends on how you understand colonization. Colonization, so from my particular perspective, colonization is well, let's say colonization during the period of capitalist modernity, right? So we're talking like over the last 500 years. It's a single phenomenon, which essentially is capitalist expansion, the capitalist expansion of Western Europe, progressively across the globe. So it is a single phenomenon, and thus colonized spaces, or places which have been colonized under those auspices by the expansion of Western Europe, they are comparable within that framework. It's the same framework. However, this doesn't mean that processes of colonization specifically in each individual place will be the same. They will be determined by the demands of the place and the specific demands of whatever, or the specific requirements of colonial power in that space. And they will also be determined by, they will also be rendered individual and unique by the way that colonized people respond to and engage with colonial impositions. So yes, I think you can read across colonial spaces, because colonization is part of a single phenomenon, a world phenomenon. However, this does not mean that what goes and what happens in one colonial instance is going to be the same as what happens in another. Does this make sense? Am I getting?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Cool. Yes. So can I ask you one back just very quickly? What is it exactly that like prompted that from what I have said so far?
Well, it was actually specifically when you're talking about the different. I should have taken a picture of the slide. I didn't. But the ways that people were separated, I think during apartheid, or it might have even been before apartheid, that like the different like entrances and things for I'm assuming like Black and white, but I don't even know if it was divided even further than that, because I know there's so many different classifications. But that I was like, whoa, that's like Jim Crow. But I think I was like, but this predates Jim Crow. And so I was thinking, like, wait, did America get its cues from South Africa, or how much like interaction between those two colonial governments was there, and how much were they taking like terrible inspiration from each other? Because like yeah, I was I guess not expecting that specifically to resonate with like imagery that I have seen in America.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I actually don't know how much explicit exchange there is between apartheid and the apartheid state and segregation politics in the US. I don't know how much explicit exchange there is, but I think that yes, you can definitely think about how those institutions are working. I think you can think about them together without reducing one to the other. Yeah,
I would actually really like to investigate that a little bit, because I'm actually knowing how much other very, very like subterfuge and like very bad stuff that like communications that America had with other international governments about like, oh, this is how we can oppress people. I'm almost positive that they probably had interactions, like government officials between. Anyway, sorry. Thank you.
All right. So if we're all good, I'm going to carry on. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So here we are. Okay. So all right. So I've kind of outlined this sense that I have of Gothic fiction as both, I mean, and I think the takeaway from what I've said so far in terms of theory is that on the one hand, Gothic has this kind of, it reflects an impulse to stabilize and organize by kind of creating an other or a counterpoint for the self or society, but then because it actually it participates in this process of creating that other, that counterpoint, it kind of incipiently undermines the actual productiveness of that exercise. And I mean, those of you who have read anything in Gothic theory, you'll know that this is kind of what I'm not saying is a whole tranche of psychoanalysis which essentially says the same thing, right? Part of what I'm doing is attempting to map out a dynamics of the Gothic that doesn't necessarily rely on a psychoanalytic paradigm for its validity. I'm sort of thinking in terms of culture, not to suggest that psychoanalysis and culture are completely distinct, but I'm thinking in terms of culture rather than in terms of individual psychologies. Okay, so I've mentioned this word, like Holly said, I've mentioned this word, the mineral, or this phrase, the mineral revolution, several times now. The mineral revolution is essentially a period of time in the late 19th century in South Africa that was inaugurated by the discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand in 1886. It is, so gold is a mineral, right? Hence mineral. And then revolution suggests rapid change. And the revolution in question here is really attendant on industrialization processes. So before the late 19th century, South Africa was a really, really marginal part of the British Empire. It didn't play a big role in the way that Britain thought about itself as an imperial power. But following the discovery of gold, South Africa became essentially the key to the British Empire. So there are two, yes, as I'm saying, so there are two key points to take away from the mineral revolution. The first is that South Africa becomes, like I say, something like an El Dorado for the British Empire. It's newly important. And the reason for this is that increasingly the industrialized nations of the colonial world are sort of situated in Northern Europe and what we might now refer to as the global North, were increasingly competing with each other by colonizing other parts of the world. So global or world hegemony was increasingly dependent on the size of an industrialized nation's empire. And South Africa, as the site of a very, very gold-rich colony, became hugely important for securing Britain's hegemony in this context where other imperial powers were competing with Britain. And then the second point to take away is that, so gold mining in South Africa created massive shifts within the country itself, or within South Africa itself, the kind of South African context itself. And specifically, gold mining, I mean, without wanting to go into the mechanics of it, the literal mechanics of it, gold mining required an enormous amount of cheap labor. The actual process of gold mining required an enormous amount of cheap labor. And the British colonial administration solved this problem, this kind of preemptive labor deficit. There was always this preemptive shortage of labor. They needed so much labor to be able to mine the gold seam, by setting up a racialized taxation system, which emerges in tandem with an early segregation system. So again, I don't want to go too much into the kind of historical details of this, but basically the point here is that there are a couple of points. The first one is that the blueprint for apartheid emerges on the gold mines. So the blueprint for apartheid segregation emerges on the gold mines with kind of a British colonial attempt to coercively produce a workforce. But then the second point, and the sort of more the wider point, is that race functions in the imperial imaginary, the British colonial imaginary, as a vindication for radical exploitation. So essentially, cheap labor is identified in the mineral revolution in terms of race. Race becomes a way of legitimating low wages and very low standards of living, radical exploitation, and that's important. So two things. First one is gold mine, global international competition between industrialized powers of Northern Europe. And the second one is race functions to legitimate or vindicate an exploitative regime of labor, which is essentially the thing which keeps the gold mine going and thus secures Britain's status in the world order at the end of the 19th century. So, okay, books, less history, more books. Right, so I'm gonna talk really briefly about these two novels, which are kind of representative of a canon of imperial adventure narratives that spring up in and around South Africa, and that kind of overtly have got to do with gold mining. I haven't mentioned diamond mining, but diamond mining actually predates gold mining in South Africa, and both of these texts actually deal with diamonds, which is an interesting choice, which I can talk about a little bit later on. Well, I will, if you would like me to talk about that more, I can talk about that more later. Okay, so we're looking now at King Solomon's Mines by H. Rider Haggard, which some of you might be familiar with already. And then this novel is slightly less famous, called Prester John, it's by John Buchan. So both of these novels hinge on scenarios in which treasure is discovered in Southern Africa. And they are set also, well, Buchan's novel specifically is set in the context of a mineral-rich South Africa. Both novels feature British colonial adventurers as the protagonists, and these are kind of idealized types. They're morally robust and essentially generally supposed to be sympathetic characters that we identify with and relate to. I'm not saying we do identify with and relate to them, but we are supposed to. They are sympathetic. And then in both texts, access to this treasure, which is located somewhere in South Africa, is impeded by threats that come from African antagonists who are characterized by racist imperial Gothic stereotypes of savagery or primitivism. So both of these narratives feature racialized, monstrous characters, and the function in the narrative of those racialized, monstrous characters is to stand in the way of the treasure that the imperial adventurers are, or the colonial adventurers are seeking out. So we have a situation in which racialized, monstrous figures are impeding the process of a colonial treasure hunt. There are lots of reasons why this is interesting. Something which I haven't actually said, but something which does always strike me when I think about these texts, is that at the time that both of them were written, or by the time that both of them were written, all of the indigenous peoples of South Africa had been brought under colonial rule, and so there was no major indigenous threat present to gold mining, right? So there was no kind of radical uprising around about this time, which unsettled the mining industry or did literally prevent colonial powers from accessing gold and diamonds, which suggests that these figures are ciphers for something else, right? Are ciphers for a different kind of anxiety. So both of these novels end with the vanquishing of African antagonists and the reinstatement of colonial authority over African people and also over mineral wealth. So I realize I am going to really race through them. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but I'm kind of just picking out the similarities. In both instances also, the racialized Gothic lexicon of monstrosity, it does something like legitimates the colonial stewardship of South Africa and the racialized, and this is important, the racialized organization of labor on the South African gold mine. So this is specifically explicit in Prester John, which Prester John deals with this kind of imperial nightmare of indigenous uprising. And it is explicitly set in the context of diamond mining. It is also a narrative which, so it provides some room for this sense that there may be pushback from colonized people to the violent practices of the colonial mineral regime. But then it kind of exorcises that threat by essentially ending up, I mean, it literally, the final scenes of the narrative have all of the novel's remaining indigenous people working on a diamond mine overseen by the colonial protagonist. So it's incredibly explicit. And the sort of sense there is that this is the correct organization of society, and what kind of legitimates that sense that this is the correct organization of society are the scenes of monstrous savagery which predate the that kind of setting up of the sort of, you know, reorganization, the reconsolidation of the mineral regime. The sense is that colonized peoples need to be colonized because of their inherent savagery or monstrosity. So these racialized Gothic figures, they kind of tack into that logic that legitimates labor exploitation in the actual existing mineral regime. This is kind of the point that I'm making. So the point here is that Gothic in these narratives is strongly conservative. Racialized Gothic others stabilize imperial identity, and then in the case of Prester John specifically, validate the actual operation of colonial industry. But, right, at the same time, so I've already sort of said that so as Gothic attempts to do this, it can be seen as a way of kind of managing situations, of stabilizing identities. But as it does that, it kind of undoes itself. And this is the case in these narratives, although in this instance, that undoing is not conscious. It's not strategic. It happens as a kind of byproduct of the very strategy of othering. So Gothic also undermines the conservative agenda in both Prester John and King Solomon's minds, registering the instability of Britain within the geopolitical landscape. And here, a line from Patrick Brantlinger's really excellent book, Rule of Darkness, which was published in 1989, and which kind of is one of the early critical texts to think about Imperial Gothic and what it is. He writes, Brantlinger writes, imperial romances do not offer salvationist answers. They offer instead insistent images of decline and fall. Imperial Gothic expresses anxieties about the weakening of imperial hegemony, about British progress transformed into British backsliding. So Gothic is a lexicon of imperial anxiety and not a foolproof stabilizing discourse. And so the sense here is that even though Gothic's function, or its kind of explicit function, is an attempt to stabilize and control and shore up and reiterate an imperial identity, an imperial agenda, or imperial social organization, the fact that it is a lexicon that is rooted in anxiety means that that is never really going to work. So if a narrative, if you're sort of trying to stabilize yourself by conjuring up images of your own anxiety and then expelling them, there's still images of your anxiety. This is the kind of thinking here. There's still those, something which is rooted in anxiety is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to use that as a stabilizing, securing mechanism. And what I find really interesting here is that in both of these texts, the supposedly African villains, the supposedly African monsters, are really explicitly connected to other imperial powers in Northern Europe. So in Prester John, the kind of revolutionary king is shown to be working in tandem with a Portuguese associate. Portugal controls Mozambique, which is on the South African border. And there was ongoing tension during the imperial period, or during the colonial period, between South Africa and Mozambique, between Britain and Portugal, around access to rail transit between the two countries, and also around labor, because much of the labor on the gold mines came from Mozambique. So there is a sense here that these are racialized Gothic figures, but they are connected to other imperial powers, suggesting that the anxiety that they articulate is an anxiety about Britain losing hegemony within the context of the world economy, within the context of warring or of interstate competition for colonial control. So the idea here is that these figures kind of serve as, these racialized figures serve as a kind of a triangulation point. And this is actually, this is an argument which is really lucidly and really convincingly made by Stephen Shapiro in an essay called Transylvania. He's actually writing about Dracula, but he makes this point about the triangulation of fear in imperial texts. In King Solomon's Mines, this strategy is even more explicit, because Quatermain, who is Haggard's protagonist, he compares the Kukuana, who is a people who he kind of makes up, invents for the purposes of this story. He compares them explicitly to Germany, and Germany was, for South Africa at the time, a specific threat, because Germany Germany was in control of Namibia, which is on the west coast, or the sort of northwest of South Africa, and there was a relationship between the Afrikaner administration in the region of the gold mines and Namibia. So and the Germans, and so Germany really did pose a major and kind of often explicitly articulated threat to British continued control of gold in South Africa. So yes, so this is my point. So the point here is that, on the one hand, these narratives gothicize race in a way which kind of stabilizes the mineral regime, because it replicates those narratives or those discourses which are used to construct African people as a laboring resource. And the laboring resource, remember, cheap labor is the thing that the gold mines needed in order to function. But then on the other hand, all the way through these narratives, those racialized monstrous characters are kind of explicitly reveal themselves to other Britain's sense of its own precarity, its own decline. There's a sense on the one hand of an attempt to organize, and on the other hand, a kind of a very subsequently happening disorganization, a kind of a dissolution of that process. Okay, so from here, okay, so this is a kind of little transition period from colonial to post-colonial Gothic. So I'm going to make a leap in a moment from the late 19th century to the late 20th century, right? So from one turning point, one revolutionary moment to another revolutionary moment. And I'm going to sort of, that leap is also a kind of a leap in narrative strategy. So where we've just seen that Writers like Haggard and Buchan use Gothic in order to stabilize imperial identities and organizations, and kind of almost by accident, Gothic kind of undoes that stabilizing action. Gothic that's written around the fall of apartheid exploits that disorganizing potential. So it exploits that capacity for Gothic figures to disorganize organization, to unravel kind of formations of power. And so these are texts which exploit that potential in order to critique and then sometimes also imaginatively reconfigure oppressive apartheid, but then also oppressive or difficult post-apartheid cultural and material formations. Okay, so I'm going to take another break here, and then if people have questions, you can ask them. So I'm going to stop sharing. Right. How's everybody doing? Are you still with me? Broadly speaking.
Yes.
Maddie had a question.
Okay.
I don't have to ask it if other people have questions, because Rebecca and I talk a lot anyway. But yeah, basically, I was wondering what you make of figures like Quatermain being included in 20th and 21st century pop culture narratives, like the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Like, what does that say about our current climate, especially thinking about like Shapiro's talking about, you know, Gothic narratives being attached to specific capitalist, I forget the word that he uses, but it's a very good word, capitalist moment, epochs, that's what it is. Yeah, so what does he, Quatermain being included, because he's kind of usually the most obscure. There's always like Victor Frankenstein and Dorian Gray and Mina Harker and all this stuff. And then there's like, oh, Alan Quatermain. And at least to, I think, Americans, it's like, oh, who is this guy? Yeah, so what do you make of that?
So, I mean, there is I don't know, okay, I don't know about in the States, right? And I see how that is I see how he would come up as relatively obscure as a character. But it's not just Alan Quatermain, right? So there's a whole, there is much imperial nostalgia in the UK specifically. So Quatermain is this this kind of imperial hero. He represents this kind of sanitized, glorious Britishness. Is this, I mean, does this make sense to you? And I feel like this is something which is being invoked, not just in sort of occasionally, but this is something which is being invoked in political discourse in Britain, and which is kind of incipiently present in a lot of kind of innocuous or more innocuous kind of British pop culture. Even things like, I mean, I don't want to knock the Bake Off too much, but even things like, you know, stuff like the Great British Bake Off is this sort of glorification of an earlier moment of British, well, an earlier moment of British what is it, the word I'm looking for? It's security and strength and, you know, fiber, moral fiber, like these kinds of ideas. And I think that the kind of return of, I mean, the return of Quatermain, but the return of other kind of analogous figures and discourses, yes, exactly, other analogous figures and discourses, sort of, I think they can be read as efforts to stabilize identity in a moment when everything is, you know, as we know, radically unstable. We're approaching Brexit, and we're now in the middle of a pandemic, and geopolitical relationships are shifting. The nature of geopolitical power is shifting. And I think, so I feel like this sort of imperial nostalgia, it does function like that as an attempt to kind of control a difficult global situation, or a global situation in which Britain is kind of ceding in terms of its influence, and doing that by kind of invoking a nostalgic sense of a great British past. Does this make sense? It's not Gothic. I mean, that is not Gothic. That is nostalgic more than Gothic. But in that sense, performing a similar kind of crisis management function that I think Imperial Gothic does attempt to perform. Does that answer your question a little bit, Madeline?
Yes.
I had just like a fact question. Sorry, it's not as in-depth as Maddie's at all. But I was wondering about John Buchan and his relationship with South Africa and what that was and why. You're on mute.
Oh, I'm on mute. It had to happen at some point. So I will have known this at some point, probably in great detail. But right now, I actually don't know exactly what John Buchan's relationship to South Africa is, because he must have one. The whole novel is set, because he's Scottish, and the novel is basically set between Edinburgh and the kind of eastern reaches of the then British South African colony. But have you got any sense? I actually don't know. I can,
I was trying to remember, but I couldn't super remember. But there's something to do with camps in South Africa, was it, or in another?
Yes. Like I say, I haven't. I mean, I wrote this material 2 years ago, or however long ago it was. Quite probably actually longer than that. And I actually really legitimately can't remember what his relationship is. So I'll have a look. Yeah. Sorry, not helpful.
No, it was just, I have like this vague, so his job was to help with the rehabilitation of Boer women who'd been in the concentration camps, according to the article in the Transvaal. Mm-hmm. I think, I'm not quite sure what his engagement was, but I remember sort of stuff that sounded a bit, I don't know.
Prester John is a fascinating novel. I have seen very, very little work on it, and it really is, it is horrendous in many, many senses. It really, really is fascinating for its kind of really explicit engagement with the racial dynamics of mining, and its really explicit articulation of a kind of eugenicist or sort of a biological race policy, and mobilizing that to literally legitimate actually existing labor practices on the colonial mine, which were kind of underpinning the whole, so this is a massive statement, but we're really playing a major role in stabilizing the British Empire at the time. South African gold mines were incredibly important to the British Empire. And so it was crucial that the labor could continue to kind of be siphoned into those mines at the rate that it was. And in order to do that, they needed these discourses, and Buchan, he lays them out there. Mm-hmm. So it is really interesting. It's also not very widely available, that novel, but I would recommend, if people are interested in Imperial Gothic, I would recommend reading it. I don't even have a copy anymore, but the copy that I had, I ended up having to buy it for some ridiculous amount of money, and it came from 1957, I think. And that is literally the copy that I used to write the book. Not that I didn't have a newer one.
I can help people with that if you're wanting a copy. My second bookshop has several copies of Prester John for some reason.
Yeah. Right. Well, we can talk about that.
My second question was about the diamond thing, because you said you might tell us more about that, and I was wanting to know.
Sure. So there was a difference between gold and diamond mining. Gold mining was by necessity incredibly labor intensive, and thus more political. So this is an argument against. So this is an argument that's made by Laura Chrisman in her book on Imperial Gothic or Imperial Romance, and essentially she makes it really. She has a series of really great insights into the way that minerals work in King Solomon's mines specifically, where basically her sense, I think, is that Haggard writes about diamonds and not about gold, because gold raises too many questions. Diamonds are more diamonds are more politically palatable than gold. Gold is so political and so important to the British Empire and so closely connected to race relations that it is difficult to write an imperial romance, an adventure story about gold as a mineral. So he writes about diamonds, which is yes, it is, and they both write about diamonds, which is really, really interesting because comparable to gold, diamonds are much less important in the context of the British Empire.
Interesting.
Okay, is everybody good? Yes? Yes. Okay, all right, I'm gonna carry on. I'm just gonna go straight through the next couple of sections and then we can have a chat after that. So I'm sharing my screen. I think, yes I am. Okay, good. All right, so as I said, I'm going to make this shift now from the late 19th century to the late 20th century, and that shift is actually also a shift between a Gothic, which serves this kind of conservative and stabilizing function, and kind of by accident, any sort of resistant or dissonant significance to that Gothic is kind of unintentional. To a Gothic that really exploits that dissonant potential which exists in earlier Gothic formations. And so this is something like a shift between a colonial and a post-colonial Gothic framework. All right, so like I say, we're now at the end of the 20th century, around about the end of the 20th century, during a period which was called by Nadine Gordimer the South Africa's interregnum. So an interregnum is a period between two regimes. And even though at the end of the 20th century, South Africa was still officially the apartheid state, there were various things happening in and around about South Africa which made the sense that the apartheid state would not continue forever palpable. So the first thing, which is probably the most important, is that states around about South Africa were decolonizing. Most notably for the novel, which I'll go on to talk about very briefly, Mozambique, which is next door to South Africa. Also in the late or the mid-70s, there was a return of active protests. So the resistance movements in South Africa had been banned since around about I think it was 1960 that the ANC was banned. And so active protest had been suppressed. Also by a whole series of laws banning public gatherings and so on. So in 1976, the Soweto Uprising, which I actually meant to mention earlier and didn't, took place, and it kind of really marks this moment of a return to active protest. So the Soweto Uprising was a youth protest where school children gathered to protest against the laws which had just been passed, which essentially made education for Black children Afrikaans medium rather than English medium. And there's a sense here, I mean, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but there is a sense that the reason for the protest is that Afrikaans was the language of the state, and so the sort of language of hegemony, and making it so that young Black children would have to learn and only in Afrikaans was kind of quite, definitely quite rightly seen as a kind of an ideological mechanism of control. The children were protesting, and the police, really tragic, one of many tragedies across the history of apartheid South Africa, but the police opened fire on the children, and a large number of people were killed. So this is the return. This moment, this protest kind of marks it's a real sort of landmark on the map of declining apartheid. So even though there was this sense as a result of the return of active protest and a result of decolonization in other parts of Africa, even though there was this sense that of the apartheid state was declining, it was very unclear as yet what exactly would take apartheid's place, and how that revolution would be negotiated or not negotiated. So how that revolution would unfold. So there was a sense that the way that reality was organized was buckling, falling apart, but there was as yet not really any clear sense about what was going to take its place, or how that actual real falling apart would happen. And Gaudimer, in her essay, which was actually a lecture that she gave in the early 80s, which is called Living in the Interregnum, she quotes Antonio Gramsci, and this is a very famous way of describing this particular period in South African history. So she writes, it's the quote at the top of the screen: "The old is dying, the new is not yet born, and in this interregnum there arises a great variety of morbid symptoms." So this is Gramsci, and this is Gaudimer using Gramsci to discuss South Africa at the end of the 20th century. And my sense, to kind of jump ahead a little bit, is that some of these morbid symptoms, right, that she's discussing, that she's borrowing from Gramsci, some of these morbid symptoms arise or manifest in literary imaginary, and they do that in Gothic forms. So the interregnum is also, I mean, the relationship between the literary imaginary and the interregnum has been taken up by a number of critics, but specifically most kind of fully by Stephen Klingman, who writes that the literature of the interregnum in South Africa, so the literature of the end of the 20th century, is remarkable for a persistent aesthetic quality, which has got to do with, which problematizes representation itself. So he suggests that literary narrative of this period depicts, and this is the quote at the top of the screen, a reality that is loosed from its moorings. And then he writes, like shifting tectonic plates, a gap was opening up between the real and any pre-existing apparatus for discerning or codifying it. So what does all of this mean? And why might a problematics of representation relate, or how does a problematics of representation relate to this condition of what Nadine Gaudimer is calling interregnal? So the sense here that Klingman is invoking is that the feeling of impending change, the feeling of events which are about to happen, but which are not yet fully describable or fully visible, works to kind of defamiliarize the habituated structures and patterns of reality. Specifically, the habituated structures and patterns of apartheid reality for the white population in particular. So the sense that decolonization is coming suddenly requires or makes the white population, has the capacity to make the white population see apartheid as something other than a habituated everyday practice. And I think something, I mean, as I'm saying this, I think something maybe that I could that needs to be stressed here is that during those kind of high moments of apartheid, where resistance was so powerfully repressed, there were, for certain parts of the population, for certain privileged parts of the population in particular, violence was not a day-to-day encounter. Apartheid was normal. And this is basically what Gaudimer's point is in her essay, Living in the Interregnum, that white South Africans were so incredibly used to the bizarre situation that they were living in. They were so incredibly habituated to it that it had ceased to seem fully bizarre. She talks about, she has a metaphor of a kind of a contact lens. She says that apartheid, the habit of apartheid had slipped the kind of device into the eye of the white population, which meant that they could no longer see the situation that they were living in for what it was. And Klingman's point is that as as decolonization, as the end of apartheid becomes a possibility, that familiarization begins to reverse. So it becomes clear that what has been habituated and normalized, and the kind of texture of day-to-day experience, it becomes clear that what that is hugely artificial, but also more specifically that it depends on the violent oppression, or it depends on multiple structures of violent oppression. So the everydayness of apartheid, in becoming defamiliarized, also kind of that process also reveals the kind of the suppressiveness, the oppressiveness, the violence of apartheid as a system. And from our perspective, looking at it, 21st century, we have a clear sense that apartheid is violent. Apartheid was the most violent racial regime, arguably, ever. But Gordimer's point is that from within the context, within that moment, from a privileged perspective, that violence was not visible. Okay, and so this is what Klingman is talking. So this sense of kind of reality coming apart from, or the world coming apart, being unloosed from its moorings, the normal, the everyday, losing their purchase on a kind of an external world. He suggests that this is registered in literary aesthetics as a problem of representation. Basically, if everything I know is conditioned by the apartheid state, if everything I know and all the ways that I know are conditioned by the reality and the kind of ordinariness of apartheid, then that world changes, then how will I access the world? So my access to the world ceases to exist. This is the sense. Okay. So what does this have to do with Gothic? So what I'm suggesting is that the interregnal condition is engaged in Gothic forms that seek to unbury or excavate the structural violence on which that apartheid, that white apartheid everyday rests. And this sounds like this is perhaps one of the clearest Gothic scenarios in South African literature from the late 20th century. This sense of digging up the violent structures, the obscured violent structures of the present. So the point here also is that by bringing that violence back into plain view, interregnal Gothic narratives defamiliarize habituated apartheid realities and reveal their constructed nature. So by showing that the present is only constructed through processes of violent repression, the present comes to be defamiliarized. And then this is something, as I say, this is a strategy which is really taken up quite consistently across the late 20th century and by some major figures in South African literature. So in the book, I talk about J.M. Coetzee's In the Heart of the Country. I talk about Etienne van Heerden's novel Ancestral Voices, Reza de Wet's play African Gothic, and then the text that I'm going to look at now briefly, Nadine Gordimer's novel The Conservationist. What is important about this particular selection of narratives is that they are all rewritings of the South African farm novel, which is called the Plaasroman. Kind of it's the Afrikaans name, but it's the word which is used generally to refer to this particular literary genre. So all of these texts rewrite the Plaasroman in a Gothic way, using Gothic forms, and in so doing reflect interregnal sensibilities and anxieties and critical strategies. So what is the Plaasroman? The Plaasroman is an early 20th century genre, usually associated with Afrikaans literature, but there are also examples of the Plaasroman sort of translated into an English South African idiom as well. J.M. Coetzee, in his really famous book, White Writing, which is a series of critical essays about South African literature, he calls the Plaasroman the literature of white pastoral. So, and I'm going to try and rocket through this, because I know I said that there wasn't another really theoretically dense section of the chapter, but this is a little bit theoretical. I mean, less of the chapter of the talk. There's a little bit of theoretical density here. So, the literature of white pastoral, the Plaasroman. What does that mean to say literature of the white pastoral? Essentially, Coetzee argues that the Plaasroman is a highly politicized mode of writing, a highly politicized literary form. And the pastoral idyll in particular, the pastoral scene, something we might sort of refer to it as the pastoral scene, in particular, serves a crucially, serves this highly politicized function. The suggestion here is that the pastoral scene is defined as that which represents the harmony, a harmony between society on the one hand, or a social configuration on the one hand, and the natural world, right? The society in question in these narratives, in the Plaasroman, is a white rural order. And this is why it is political. So in representing a white rural order in harmony with the natural world, the pastoral encodes or naturalizes a white rural order. I'm hoping that this makes sense. You can ask me questions about this. Specifically, the pastoral encodes a natural white right to the land. There's a long history, there's a kind of wider history behind this, which I'm not going to go into, but it has to do with the fragility of white Afrikaner land claims in the early 20th century in South Africa. So the white pastoral can be seen as a kind of a response to a fragile land claim from within the Afrikaner community. And its response to that kind of sense of precarity is to write narratives in which a white right to the land is naturalized, is presented as the natural, as natural and thus right. Okay. Coetzee's more complicated point is that a white claim to the land in the pastoral, in the white pastoral, in the Plaasroman, the white claim to the land depends on white, in brackets, but depends on labor. So why is it that the white rural order can show that they are, that the land is, that they have a right to the land? It is because they have worked to transform the land from kind of wilderness into an idyllic pastoral space. So through work, which creates the pastoral idyll, the literal aesthetics of the pastoral, through work, the white farmer and his family and so on assert their claim to the earth. Coetzee's point, major point, but second point, is that this strategy of naturalizing a white land claim essentially only works because it denies a history of coloniality and the labor practices that this has entailed. And so I'm hoping that this particular quote will make all of this slightly clearer. So Coetzee writes, if the work of hands on a particular patch of earth, he's writing about the farm novel specifically, right, not generally. If the work of hands on a particular patch of earth is what inscribes it as the property of its owners by right, then the hands of black serfs doing the work had better not be seen. So the point here is that the pastoral, the Plaasroman, the white pastoral, encodes a white right to the land in a pastoral scene which is achieved through representations of white labor. So the pastoral scene is carved out of the wilderness by the white farmer and his family, and that is what kind of anchors the the white right to the land. In reality, this is the sort of simple way of articulating this point. In reality, the White Farm was not a white-only organization. In reality, the White Farm will have been a highly racialized organization. The work that is in the pastoral shown to be done by the white farmer will have been done by black servants or sharecroppers or other members of the household who were not white. The Plasterman cannot show that history, and so it brackets it out. And those of you who know anything about Freud can, I'm sure, see where we're going with this. So the entire pastoral mode rests on a denial of colonial history. This is the point. Cannot represent colonial history, it shuts it out. So this was the early 20th century. Late 20th century writers rewrite that mode, that Plasterman, that white pastoral. They rewrite the early Plasterman using the Gothic to retrieve the history of colonial exploitation that the original Plasterman has to exclude in order to be able to make its political claims. So the kind of Gothic paradigm that is in play here is broadly Freudian and hinges on Freud's reading of the uncanny, which I think will be probably familiar to most people. But the uncanny is the familiar foreign, right? So Freud's very famous quote in the middle of the slide, the uncanny is that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar. So for Freud, encounters with the uncanny, which is that the kind of scary thing, which is scary or unsettling because it combines familiarity with foreignness. Encounters with the uncanny are encounters with, in his kind of model of the mind, they are encounters with the returning repressed. So the uncanny, a brush with the uncanny signals that you have, that you're engaging with something which you have shut out of your conscious mind for one reason or another, right? But because it is inconsistent, because it would be too disruptive, that something that you have shut out of your conscious mind and that has now returned in disguise as something else. So you recognize the uncanny thing because it is part of yourself, but you don't recognize it, the foreign quality or the foreign dimension of the uncanny, you don't recognize it because the psychic apparatus has disguised it to kind of allow it to come back up into conscious life. And so this quote from, I always find this quote from Civilization is Discontents quite helpful when I'm thinking about the uncanny. Freud writes, nothing which has once been formed can perish. Everything is somehow preserved, and that in suitable circumstances it can be brought back to light. So repressing elements of your psychic life which are too disruptive to be maintained, repressing those elements does not get rid of them. They will return in disguised form. Famous examples of the uncanny, often kind of noted in Gothic criticism, are ghosts, uncanny because they are dead and alive, dead bodies, uncanny because they resemble the living but are not. So we're talking familiar foreign, repetitious acts because repetition can be familiar, but then with a difference is foreign. So these are, yes, famous sort of Gothic-y examples of the uncanny, and they actually all do come up in the kind of rewritten Gothic pastoral of the late 20th century South African novel. Okay, so in the late 20th century, in the late 20th century rewritings of the Plasterman, uncanny figures intrude into the pastoral idyll. And so and as they do that, they suggest that the pastoral idyll is not natural, right? It's not stable and the real world, but is constructed through processes, through something like repression. The point here is that the presence of the uncanny in the pastoral idyll invokes the possibility of repression. It suggests that the pastoral idyll is not all there is, that there is another dimension which has been shut out, basically just like the unconscious. Hence my the way that I think about these narratives is that these rewritten Gothic plastromans, is that they write the pastoral in such a way that gestures towards its unconscious. They write the uncanny, the presence of the uncanny in the pastoral of the late 20th century suggests that the pastoral has an unconscious from which those uncanny figures have returned. Okay. So let's race through the conservationist. So in the book, I talk about a number of texts, but I'm going to focus on this one because it kind of makes my argument very clear. Again, this is similar arguments have been made by other critics as well. Everything that I said, this particular strand is this particular version of the Gothic, this sense of the Gothic inhering in the returning repressed in the conservationist. It's not only mine. Stephen Klingman writes similar things. Okay, so the conservationist is set in the 1970s. It tells the story of Mourning, who is a very wealthy white hobby farmer who has kind of bought a farm essentially for fun, for a series of reasons, tax relief, but also as a place to bring his mistress. He's bought a farm on the outskirts of Johannesburg. Close to the beginning of the novel, the body of a black man is found in one of the pastures, the third pasture on Mouring's farm. No one knows who he is. He's anonymous. He remains anonymous all the way through the text. And the way that the police deal with the encounter is that they hastily bury him in the earth and then they disappear. They're supposed to come back and sort the situation out, but they never do. So the novel is, I should say, written in a kind of stream of consciousness-y style. That's the technical term. And so it's difficult to kind of extract really standalone quotations that I can kind of point to and say this is where it's doing this. But so I've given it a shot to give you a sense of how the narrative invokes pastoralism, but then also how the narrative populates the pastoral with a sense with uncanny figures that then gesture towards the sense of there being a pastoral unconscious. So the pastoral scene from the earlier Plasterman is invoked. So in this particular passage, Mourning looks out across the very field where the man is buried. And he says, the field dips away before it rises again towards the river, just touching, floating above its contours is a nap of blue that brushes across the grain to mauve. There is no wind, but the air is itself a constant welling. And there's this sense of natural beauty, and he kind of communes with nature all the way, or communes with extra human nature all the way through the text. And I read that sense of him becoming, he kind of becomes one with his landscape, or he feels that he is becoming one with his landscape. And I kind of read that as Gaudemer's translation of that sense of a naturalization of the white social order with the land that the earlier Plasterman depicts as well. And then across the text also, Mourning has strange encounters. None of them, they are, again, because of the style that the text is written in, this is subtle, they are subtle. The undermining of that kind of pastoral beauty is just really, really subtly done all the way through the text. One instance is this one where he's walking again through the same pasture where he feels himself kind of fragmenting. So the line is, he hears himself as if he were coming towards himself, about to come face to face with, and then it trails off. That's her ellipsis. He stops dead. So there is this sense, and then around the same part of the text, actually, there's the children who live, the farm workers' children, You learn that they don't go to this place anymore because there is something there, there's a presence there. Earlier on in the novel, Mourning imagines being, or actually I think it's actually slightly later in the novel, Mourning imagines, he's kind of walking through the marshy territory, and he imagines that there is a black hand in the soil pulling him down as his feet sink into the mud. So there are these kinds of uncanny moments that permeate the text subtly, but and that kind of undermine that sense of robust pastoralism that is being invoked, and gesture towards what we know is lying underneath the surface. So gesture towards, but frame that kind of substrate as something like an unconscious. Okay, so from there, I'm just checking the time. So from there, the kind of major action in the text, a storm comes in from Mozambique, and this is important, and I mentioned it earlier right at the beginning, because Mozambique is at the time in the novel in the process of decolonizing. So a storm comes, kind of washes over Meiring's farm, and we know that it comes from Mozambique, so that it's kind of loaded with this symbolic meaning. The storm essentially is an avatar for decolonization. The storm destroys the pastoral idyll. So what Mourning has described in terms of this kind of all of this sort of natural beauty and a sense of communion with it, the storm destroys it, and actually the depiction of the pasture after the storm is really quite intensely Gothic. He suggests he suggests that the land looks like the innards of a chicken. So there's a kind of a carnality given to the land, and there's sort of worms, and the soil is totally waterlogged. It becomes no longer possible really to repress anything in the soil, because Gordimer explicitly says anything that is kind of sinks down into the mud is insistently brought back up again, including the body, right? So the body that is buried in the soil, where it has kind of resurfaced throughout the text in these kinds of weird glitches in the pastoral reality, it resurfaces in its physical form, and there is a moment of horror and confrontation where we are shown this the corpse which has been enclosed in the soil. The pastoral cannot cope as a mode with the presence of a decaying body, right? It can no longer be pastoral if there is a decaying body, and I think that is important. So that if there are politics encoded in pastoral aesthetics, then the retrieval, on an aesthetic level, the retrieval of the corpse fractures those politics. This is no longer a pastoral story. This is something like a horror story. After this, not only does the body physically resurface, but Mourning leaves the narrative in a state of total panic, which suggests that just as the farm has been kind of reconfigured by this symbolic process of decolonization, this decolonizing storm, just as the farm has been reconfigured by that, so has Meiring's consciousness. And he leaves in this kind of state, as I say, state of wild, sort of wild panic. Gordimer is actually quite famous for kind of putting her protagonists in these situations towards the end of her texts. Okay, so the conservationist rewrites the Place Romane in order to unravel the politicized agenda of the Place Romane, which remember the pastoral scene in the early Place Romane serves to naturalize a white right to the land. In Gordimer's text, that pastoral scene, that politicized pastoral scene, is haunted by the history that it has to exclude. It is then destroyed by the resurfaced body, which is loaded with decolonial significance. So the ruined pastoral scene figures decolonization, and it also suggests, via Meiring's sort of madness, that decolonization will require a remaking of white psychology. So this is where we sort of come back to the point I was discussing earlier in relation to Gordimer's essay about the interregnum, where she is kind of really trying to drive home how much white psychology is bound up with the material processes of apartheid. how much apartheid has become kind of just an inured set of expectations for a certain part of the white population. Her point here, and I think she's kind of exploring this in this novel as well as in that essay, her point here is that the unmaking of apartheid will really require the unmaking of white psychology, and that is essentially what we have happening in this text. So what we have, and so the kind of the way that the narrative ends is that we have an anxious vision of an interregnal moment, right? A white protagonist who is unable to relinquish or adapt the apartheid codes that he has available for interpreting the world. In that situation, he becomes immersed in a world that he can actually not interpret, right? And hence he kind of leaves this, and it becomes very, very stream of consciousness, the text, the style of the text, it kind of becomes really, really jagged and disrupted and difficult to make sense of what's happening. And Stephen Klingman, he puts it something like, the grid of Mehring's sense slides completely out of control. Okay, right, I know we've had our 2 breaks, but I'm just going to super quickly stop again right now because the next section is the shortest and I just feel like people may have, that was a lot, and people may have things that they want to ask. So, how's everybody doing? Still broadly present?
Yes. Does anyone have any questions?
I am reading Madeline's, yes, that's interesting. Oh, good. I'm glad it's incredibly interesting. Yes.
I think one of the things that's slightly, I'm not quite sure how it's working, is that sort of you're engaging with the uncanny as a, broadly speaking, as a psychoanalytic theory, but applying that more to a sense, a broader sort of societal sense of the uncanny and the repressed. I'm not quite sure how those are interrelating with each other.
This is a very good question. Thank you, Holly. No, I'm not really doing that. Basically, these texts, these narratives, they are explicitly psychoanalytic. So I mean, people must have kind of it must be sort of clear from what I've been saying about Gordimer. We're in postmodern theory, big time. So these, which actually often kind of anticipate your theoretical reading because they are born of that moment, that kind of post-structuralist moment where, constructed including theory. So they're using the Freudian paradigm really with a high level of self-consciousness. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
The way that works on a kind of a more broad social level. So in the actual book, I use Frederick Jameson's unconscious kind of works with both Freud, Lacan, and Marx in order to that is
glitching quite a bit,
using
Rebecca.
Jameson to write white writing as well. I'm sorry, I don't know how to fix it.
No, it's all right. It normally comes back, but it's just I didn't really hear any of that. I'm so sorry. You appear to be moving like a normal human now, so maybe it's okay. Oh no, I spoke too soon.
No. Oh, did you?
Oh, did she just disappear? Oh no.
Rebecca!
She'll come back. It'll just be, oh, there she is. Oh no. We did predict this could happen. So, hey, Rebecca, are you still with us? Oh, not really.
I am with us.
Oh, okay, cool. We can't see you.
Really?
You don't have your video on. And we can't properly hear you.
Do I? Why not? I have it on. How are we doing?
You can pause the recording.
No? Yeah, but I love this. I do love this novel. It's great. And he does the same thing, but actually in a much more complicated way, because Gordimer is using quite a simple sort of Freudian paradigm of the unconscious, and Coetzee uses a Lacanian paradigm of the unconscious as language, and it becomes very, very complete, very, very, very complex from a theoretical perspective, but is also hugely self-conscious. Very, very quickly, the last thing I would say in respect to that first part of your question about the kind of societal repression, or whatever it is, the level of culture. So that is Frederick Jameson, who wrote a book called The Political Unconscious in like the early 80s, 1981. And J.M. Coetzee, in his White Writing, which is his series of essays where he writes about the pastoral, he actually uses, I mean, he doesn't do it very explicitly, but he is drawing on Jameson to create his sense of the pastoral as a mode which basically relies on the repression of history. So Jameson senses that all narrative genres and forms will have something like a political unconscious, because the way that narrative genre and form works is that it attempts to create totality. And in trying to create totality, it implicitly creates totality in response to certain ideological questions, which then don't get included in the text and then become the unconscious of the text. So that is that paradigm for how that's working. It's not specifically Freudian. Jameson uses Lacan and Marx and Freud, and Marx being the important part there. Okay. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so.
Great. How are we doing? Is everybody fine? Okay, let's talk very briefly about Mourning, and then I'm going to be done. So hopefully this is all going to work. So we've talked now about the interregnum. The last part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the period of transition. So often called the transition, right, or the transitional phase of South African history, which is the period around about, I've said 1994, but probably more accurately, sort of 1991 to around about the first decade, around about the first few years of the new millennium. This is the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's often referred to as the TRC, and I talked a little bit about that when we were talking about the timeline, when we were going through the timeline. But just to kind of remind you that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a tribunal that was set up to hear the testimony of perpetrators and victims of apartheid-era crimes. And in doing this, in fulfilling this function, what the TRC did as well was to kind of expose and then address gaps and silences in the official historiography of South Africa, or in the official history of South Africa. It gave voice to people whose experiences had not been taken into account in the writing of South African history, and it also exposed the extent of violence, of the violence underpinning the regime of apartheid. The TRC was also, it oversaw the granting of amnesty to certain perpetrators of apartheid crimes on the basis that the crimes were demanded by the state and not individually executed. And it was intended, and this is quite important, as a therapeutic process. So the idea is that in giving space, in providing space to articulate the traumatic histories of apartheid, the TRC would allow the nation to confront its past and the violences of the past, and then heal and do something like move on, which is a key concept in the way that I go on to think about the transition and transitional literature. So in the introduction to the TRC, the kind of manuscript or the transcript of the TRC testimony, which is available, you can read it online. In the introduction, Desmond Tutu, who oversaw the process, he actually says that this is about closing the book of the past, so that we can move on. We go through the past so that we can work through it in that sense of traumatic healing, and then move forward. Okay. So this kind of interest, or the processes of the TRC, of this kind of retrieval of past violences and listening to testimony about past crimes, it kind of manifests in South African literature as an interest in memory and the archive and history. So it's important in thinking about this that apartheid hegemony depended on its own technologies of history making, right? So apartheid had its own historiography, its own sort of Afrikaner nationalist historiography. And in a really now quite famous and really rich and excellent essay, Vern Harris, who's an archival historian, South African archival historian, he basically shows how the mode of apartheid historiography was positivist and kind of orientated by a sense of the truth, right? So apartheid kind of it kind of presented a version of history, or the apartheid kind of memory making machine presented a version of history that was simultaneously partial, right, really biased and selective, and also presented as if it was the whole truth. And Harris writes the following: by their silences and their narratives of power, their constructions of experiences, apartheid's memory institutions legitimized apartheid. So the process of history making is crucial to apartheid hegemony. So a preoccupation with history in transitional literature of the transition period, kind of responds to that mode of history making. And it does that in part by focusing on a need to narrativize the past in such a way that the future, unlike the past, becomes bearable. And so the point, the key part of that sentence is narrativize the past in such a way that, right? So what literature shows is that it is not only what is told in history, it's not only the kind of content of history, it's not only whose stories are told, which is also obviously crucial, it is also how those stories are narrated that will make a difference in the process of healing and quote unquote sort of moving on. I'm putting that in quotation marks because, well, for the reasons which will become now immediately clear. Okay, so not everybody was, without wanting to overstate criticism of the TRC was not unproblematic, right? It had the people, quite high profile members of South Africa's cultural institutions kind of raised certain questions around its process and around the effectiveness of it. So this is Andre Brink. He says, the TRC is intent on effecting reconciliation through establishing as fully as possible the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Truth in this context being equated with facts. And the problem that Brink is raising here really is that the mode of history that might emerge from the TRC, if this is what the TRC was, right? This attempt to find the truth. Brink's kind of problem is that mode of history that will emerge from that process will look very much like the mode of history that the apartheid state produces, or the mode of history making in which the apartheid state engaged. And the sense of history that we're talking about here is something like the notion of history as a finite record, right? And that the apartheid history, and that apartheid history is then sort of viewed somehow as an incomplete record, which can be nonetheless filled, right? So apartheid history becomes this kind of gappy text, and then the job of the TRC becomes something like filling in those gaps. And the problem that Brink is sort of gesturing at here is that this particular vision of history and this particular sense of what recovering history or re-narrating history will take is not necessarily going to assist the therapeutic process. So this line, I'm just going to straight up jump right into the Derrida, having said now twice that there wasn't that much more theory involved. This is not terribly theoretical. So Derrida, Jacques Derrida, who's a French post-structuralist, he wrote a very famous essay called Archive Fever. This is not from Archive Fever, but this is Derrida talking about Archive Fever in a sort of slightly uncharacteristically clear way. So the question we might kind of begin this section with is something like, okay, so what is the problem with viewing history as that kind of gappy record? The problem is that is this, right? What Derrida has to say. Archivization preserves, but it also begins to forget, because everything has been recorded. It may be lost. It may be forgotten. So by viewing history as a record with gaps that can be then filled, by viewing history as a book that can be closed, we might not necessarily move on from history, we might just forget it, right? And the problem with this in a post-colonial context is that if the past is forgotten, then it might return. And the future from that perspective will not necessarily be new. Okay, so I'm gonna skip through this as quickly as possible. So what is an alternative to this sense of the past as a kind of a fillable or finite history? One option is what Derrida, the same post-structuralist theorist, calls impossible mourning, right? In this version of the past, history is not about the retrieval of facts and the sort of insertion of those facts into a record, which can then be sort of declared complete. History is, or remembering is about the kind of always partial, or the recognition that any memory is always partial and never really actually complete. And then if we begin from that premise, right, that the archive can never be filled, that the archive is always necessarily incomplete, that the record is always incomplete, then the record can never be completed. And that means that we have to continue completing the record forever. So impossible mourning becomes this endless process of imperfect memory making, which, because it is endless, suggests that there can never be that risk of that history might sort of paradoxically do some forgetting. That risk is redressed. Okay, so super quickly, Brink writes a novel. This is literally the clearest example of how this idea works in Gothic forms in fiction, but there are multiple other sort of slightly less. This novel is a little bit crude. I'm not. It's a little bit kind of heavy-handed in multiple different ways, but it is very useful as an example. So basically, in this novel, The Rights of Desire, Brink uses a Gothic vocabulary in order to create a version of memory as mourning that is an unfinishable process, and that is thus ethical and can be, or more ethical than a sense of a past which can be kind of completed and a book that can be closed. So The Rights of Desire is set in democratic South Africa. It's set in a house that is haunted by a slave girl whose name is Untitled of Bengal. So slavery was abolished in 1853 in South Africa, but it is importantly suppressed in the apartheid era record, right? Because the apartheid state wanted to provide a favorable vision of colonization. So the ghost, this slave girl, thus writes into a gap that is really quite clearly described in the apartheid record. So apartheid doesn't talk about slavery. This is the ghost of a slave girl. She fills this gap in apartheid history. Ghosts are, well, what are ghosts? Ghosts, why might ghosts be interesting or useful figures in the kind of consideration of a sense of memory as mourning? The kind of key reason is because ghosts are sort of present absences. They are partial, they're always partial and obscure, spectral, kind of fragile, trace-like, rather than robust and fully present. This is kind of compounded in Brink's novel because Anke, the slave girl, only appears to certain people. Her presence is kind of really unpredictable. And so there is this sense that it's not really possible to pin her down in any way. It's not really possible to make sort of factual or propositional statements about her because she is spectral in the sense of ghostly and also kind of just difficult to kind of follow. She also in the text prompts a narrative trajectory whereby the protagonist kind of goes off on a historical exploration. So she stimulates memory because she is kind of unknowable. He sets out to know more. At the end of the text, her body is recovered from underneath the floorboards of the house. But this, and this is very important, is not a scene of any kind of straightforward closure. Instead, what Reuben finds under the house is kind of a collection of bones. And he sort of engages in this, and this is where this, I say, his text is sometimes quite heavy-handed. I mean, really quite heavy-handed. But he sort of engages in this kind of loving, nurturing attempt to kind of remember her body, and literally, as I mean remember, right, put back together. He literally tries to kind of enflesh this skeleton, but he can't do it because anything that he comes up with, anything that he imagines, is obviously a creation of his own mind. He cannot get her back. She is always going to be a trace. She's always going to be incomplete, and the kind of boniness of the Gothic symbolism sort of really drives that home. And so the scene is legible in this way as a kind of memory as mourning, right? It's the mode of history making that's being invoked is a sense of tending to the memory of the dead, which is a process that must continue ad infinitum forever, because it is never finishable or closable. And the sense is that in writing a history that can kind of keep the past alive in that way, Brink is kind of implicitly redressing what he sees as the shortcomings of a mode of history making that sort of seeks to close the book on the past of South African history. Okay, so I know we've now gone over, but that is essentially the end, right? So I'm going to just super quickly recap. Things about South African Gothic that I have said are these. South African Gothic, all of it, is in different ways a register for articulating anxiety that spikes up in moments of social transition and upheaval. I've looked at imperial Gothic narratives which were written over the Mineral Revolution in South Africa. These are a racialized Gothic lexicon. Its function is to stabilize an imperial agenda and a social organization, but it also kind of by accident as well at the same time registers the instability of the imperial program. In the interregnum, an uncanny Gothic scenes, excavate the histories that underpin apartheid realities, kind of mundane, everyday apartheid reality for the white population. And in excavating those violent histories, they defamiliarize the mundanity, the everydayness of apartheid, showing it to be resting on violence, and then also suggesting kind of that the future will require an unmaking and remaking of actual consciousness itself, modes of thinking and apprehending and knowing. In the transition, Gothic engages with the problem of post-apartheid memory, and it addresses that kind of paradoxical sense that if we write history in a certain way, history might kind of end up being a process of forgetting. We might just close the book, we might just move on. And Gothic does this in these kinds of spectral scenes, which I'm reading as scenes of impossible mourning. Okay, that is definitely that. Right, so again, I know we've gone over, but I feel like because I disappeared for a little bit, maybe that's sort of why that happened. I don't know how you, what are you thinking, Holly?
Well, generally, so if you do have to leave, because I know we're at the time, then do feel free to leave. We won't take it badly, but if you do want to stay and ask some questions, have some discussion, then we can stay for a little bit longer, I think. So yeah, do feel free if anybody has anything. I know that people have been sharing stuff and ideas in the chat, and Frank's been drawing some parallels with Brazil. I think I'm sharing that, Frank.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that I did not make that up, so I can't take credit for it, but I'm sure that other people have said that as well. But it is a good, so this is the sense of remember as remember, as put back together, yeah, which is kind of being literalized in sort of like Gothic scene. So I put my phone on, so I'm like using the data on my phone, but I just got a message saying I have no data, but I do, I have loads, so it's all fine, everything's okay. Okay. Does anybody have anything? No question. Okay, that's good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I'm just going to be cheeky and pop the link for October classes there again in case people haven't seen it if you're having to leave. But
I have sort of like a methodological question, Rebecca.
Okay.
Yes. So it sort of struck me as you were talking that like also working with like decolonial and the history of colonization and sort of like longer time periods and stuff like that. In my own work, I always feel really heavily the need to like historicize and to bring up things like, it especially struck me when you were talking about the protest in the 70s where you know the government opened fire on school children, and so I'm and also with this idea of remembering and like always having to remember instead of like forgetting the past sort of deal. So anyway, when you are approaching like writing an article or giving a talk or something like that, and I'm sure it depends on the mode as well, but like when you're approaching that, how much do you feel you have to give all this background because it is so easy for especially like obviously white people to forget? And I feel like so much of the critical background that you need in order to understand the depth of decolonial narratives or post-colonial narratives is in just even acknowledging that this history even happened. So does that make sense as a question? Like, how do you balance that remembering in that history and the critical discourse and the actual getting into what the text is saying? How do you balance that, like, in academic work?
That is a good question, and in one which I actually struggle with. Because I work on South Africa a lot, and I often because of where I'm situated as well academically. I'm at a university now in Sweden, and I was in Scotland before that, and Germany before that. So the context that I'm like always speaking in are contexts where you actually need to give quite a lot of history because all these people just literally will not know what you're talking about. So beyond the kind of ethical requirement, beyond the kind of ethical imperative to acknowledge and retrieve and locate, beyond that, like there is just a kind of practical thing of like, I literally need to tell you what this is because those won't get it. So it's tough. I always end up including more history than I think I need to. But it is important for all of the reasons that you said. I also think though that you can be gratuitous, right? So you don't, so it really, I think in the time constraints of a talk, say, or even a thesis, like it is not your job to write, it's not my job to write South African history, right? My job is to read literary narratives in the context of South African history. So the bits of the history that you need to pull up are, should be relevant. That basically is what I'm saying. I think that's how you make that cut, that call. And you might end up writing like the history of a certain colonial situation and then like cutting it back to sort of 5 or 6 sentences. Does this make sense? I feel you know this answer already. It's very straightforward. I mean, but I'm afraid I don't have anything more nuanced than that.
The thing is, I don't. I'm very bad at making cuts. So, like, Rebecca, what do I do?
It's just practice, I think, is what you do. I mean, you do need to do the history, but I think you do also just need to make sure that you're not like that you're focusing on, it should be focused, right? It should be intelligible. Okay, what are these?
Ask me for your bibliography.
Okay, my bibliography. Yes. Like, yes, I can. I will find it and share it with you.
Thank you.
It's basically, this is just, I mean, what I've done is like summarize very strategic parts of this book that I wrote. But I can also, can I just give you a massive bibliography? That might be easiest. Okay.
I posted my PhD bibliography for them at one point. Welcome to 450 texts. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else have any more questions?
Okay. Okay, no, I'm just looking at the thing. Great, right. I will, if I'll send Holly my bibliography, and then she can circulate it. Is that fine? Will that work?
Yeah, that's how it goes. I'll pop it up. Usually I pop it up on the website, if that's okay.
Yes.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for the lecture. Okay.
Well, thank you for coming, everyone, and for bearing with me while I disappeared. I really enjoyed that. It was great. Thank you for all your questions. Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you to everybody. Maybe see some of you tomorrow. We're doing, Andrew Ng is joining us, I think from Monash University. So I think he's actually based in Australia right now. And he's going to be talking to us about the monstrous feminine in Southeast Asian folklore and horror. So that should be very cool. So more stuff that I don't know anything about to learn tomorrow, which is going to be great. So yeah, thank you very much everyone for coming. Thank you to Rebecca, and I'll see Rebecca later. Might see some of you guys later, who knows? I know some of you are double attenders sometimes. So see everyone later. Bye.
Bye, everyone.